Hey, what's up? Pizza Loving Nerd here. If you're wondering why I haven't been uploading, that's because I've been doing three things. Not working on schoolwork, writing for Tech Hut, and working on risiOS. And today I will be talking about one of those things. risiOS 38. The issue is, one of my goals with risiOS is to actually contribute something to the Linux space instead of being just another Ubuntu with a theme distro. And that means I actually have to do work. That is, instead, I pledge to make risiOS a Fedora with a theme distro. Jokes aside, some of the things that make my distro different is that it is a Fedora base instead of Ubuntu and Arch, but we also integrate web apps with a fork of the Linux Mint Web App Manager that adds a store to make installation easier. By the way, funny story, the Mint Web App Manager is actually a fork of my redesign of ICE, so it's a fork of my original codebase. Anyways, we also have this thing called rtheme, and this allows you to generate themes for libidweta and GNOME Shell with a YAML file, and it does this by editing the GDK config file with the risiGNOME extension in the background for the GNOME Shell theming, and it also has a daemon that runs in the background that auto-updates the theme when you do things like switch between light and dark modes, switch theme variants, or just straight up change the theme. We also had a tool called risiScript that lets you generate GUI wizards similar to Windows installers for bash scripts, and it allows you to set different arguments. We use this in our welcome screen to make the setup process easy, and we also had some extra scripts for installing third-party web browsers and things along like that within our tweak tool, although admittedly it was implemented in a weird place. Just know before you get attached to risiScript that, I don't know if the future looks good for risiScript. So now that you know what risiOS was and basically the state of the 37 release, this video is going to go over the development hell of 38. I started the development process by going through some community feedback on DistroWatch, specifically some reviews, and I just wanted to see what people wanted me to change, and oh my god, I only have a 6.5 out of 10 on DistroWatch? That's crazy. Now, there is only 4 reviews, and 2 of them are negative reviews. First one is kind of valueless. It's just someone complaining that they don't like GNOME and basically suggesting me to redo the whole ISO with Mate, which I'm not going to do. And then they also complained about Anaconda, which is understandable, but it's easy for me to use Anaconda. But kind of a valueless review for me. However, the second review was a lot more helpful and actually contributed to the plan for risiOS 38. It did complain about GNOME, which again I think is stupid. You can't really hate a distro just for its desktop environment in my opinion. But it also complained about Chromium as the default web browser, which I don't like either. It wasn't my first choice. There's legal issues with me shipping Firefox, and so I ended up shipping GNOME Web instead, as well as some criticism of Risi tweaks in that I care too much about my branding. Outside of those 2 reviews, I do need more negative reviews for risiOS because I'm not getting criticism. I'm having a hard time finding things to improve, so just don't be that guy who writes a review because they don't like GNOME. Overall, when considering these reviews, I knew I wanted to redo Risi tweaks with a simpler UI, remove Chromium as a default browser, and make the branding a little less predominant so that risiOS just isn't Fedora with a theme. Another couple things I wanted to do was rework risiScript because it has a ton of terrible programming paradigms and the implementation was boneheaded. And I also wanted to add libidweta support to the welcome screen to make it look a little bit more modern. Now let's actually get to the development process of risiOS 38, and let's just say it was not smooth sailing. There's a reason this video is called the development hell of risiOS 38. First thing I worked on in the development process was risiScript 2.0. This was going to be an update to both the syntax for making the scripts and the backend. The main issue of 1.0 was that I kind of overcomplicated it. It works by treating everything like a script or an installer, and if it was a script, it'd have a run function, and the installers would have an install, remove, and an optional update function. And it just kind of made everything confusing because they were kind of implemented in different ways. Within these functions, each of them had an init function within it, which would let you set variables in the installer, and then a bash function, which would run whatever the script was. And then it also had checks, which basically just checked a bunch of files and everything just to make sure it installed correctly. However, the checks were kind of over-engineered. I decided to make my own functions instead of just using bash, and so the checks were kind of implemented poorly, and there were many scripts where I didn't really have a way of using a check, so I just made it exit 0. Also, it's worth mentioning that for risiScript 1.0, I never wrote documentation because it was kind of only used internally, and I knew that I wanted to rewrite it eventually, so I just assumed that other people wouldn't use it. All of this contributed to risiScript 1.0 being a complete over-engineered mess. I recently watched a Primeagen video called The Greatest Piece of Software Ever Written. It's a very funny watch, I highly recommend it, but essentially It's in a reaction to an article called the inner JSON effect, where a company created a custom language called JDiesel that connected every function together using a JSON file full of subversion revisions, and every subversion revision contained a function. That primetime video is a really good watch. Go watch it after this video because it's pretty funny. But when I was watching that video, it very reminded me of how over-engineered my build of risiScript 1.0 was. To be fair, it still wasn't as over-engineered as that JDiesel project that the video talked about. So for risiScript 2.0, I decided to redesign how the syntax worked. Instead of having two types of scripts with different functions, I just made it so that you can define your own actions, and every action would have a show function that determined whether or not it can be ran in the first place. And then you would define your elements for passing arguments, and then the run function and the check function were both just pure bash to make it easier. And I removed my convoluted random syntax for checks. So that sounds great, right? Well, I never got to finishing risiScript 2.0. Basically, after the release of risiOS 37, I took around a month break from development of risiOS, just because, I don't know. And then after that, I worked on risiScript 2.0 for a solid month and a half exclusively. And this was a pretty painful development process. Like, looking at the commit history, I have a commit called Look Up the Ending to 9-inch Nails Eraser, which if you don't know, here's the ending. It's also worth mentioning that at the time, I was horrible at pushing my code to get, and I think you can see where this is going because I had about a month's worth of code that I never pushed, and then I had a data loss incident. At that point, I was already halfway into the 6-month dev cycle of risiOS, and I had no more will to continue working on risiScript 2.0. Especially considering that it's not a big enough distro for risiScript to even get to the point where other people are going to use it and make their own scripts anyway, so it'd only be an internal thing. At that point, I decided to give up on risiScript 2.0 for now, but also just to remove 1.0. I may get back to working on risiScript 2.0 eventually, because I do like the concept, but I also kind of have another project that's a little bit different, but it's kind of the spiritual successor to risiScript anyway, so I may work on that instead. We'll see. If I ever do another crack at risiScript 2.0 though, I'm not using 1.0's codebase. I'm restarting from scratch because my old codebase is horrid. Anyway, so now we're halfway into the risiOS 38 development cycle with nothing to show, and that's when I decided to work a little bit more on our theme, because in my opinion as the risiOS developer, that is the coolest feature that I've made so far. First thing I did was rework how the plugin system in our theme worked just to make it a little bit more stable, but I also made it so plugins can add custom properties that themes can set, and I also made it so that they can add some custom flags, which means I can do things like set a no GNOME shell flag to prevent shell theming. I also fixed it randomly sending notifications sometimes when it wasn't needed, like when initially applying the theme to your new installation in Anaconda during the installation, which prompted a random notification for a theme change even though it wasn't on your host system. Finally, I redid most of the pre-installed themes. The default theme in risiOS 37 was based on an older version of Adwaita, like before libadwaita, and for the sake of consistency, I decided to rebrand it to using normal Adwaita again, and to allow our theme just as a tool for power users to customize their system. So I renamed the old risiOS 37 default to Classic and added a GNOME 3.38 inspired shell theme and created a new Risi theme that is just Adwaita with a different shell theme. I also updated the now called Classic theme to include the new proposed accent colors from GNOME 45, and added the accent colors also to both the new Risi theme and the stock Adwaita theme. If you're wondering why there's an Adwaita theme in the first place when it's theming GDK, it's because in the future I'd like to add support for things like Qt, and it's going to use Adwaita colors from that theme to theme Qt just for the sake of consistency. I want to make this an all-in-one theming solution for GNOME. So from my current description, you may think our theme development was smooth sailing. However, right before Fedora 38's released, I realized I never ported the GNOME shell plugin to GNOME 44, and that would come to bite me in the ass because I spent an entire day trying to get that working, while I was in the process of fighting with Risi Welcome, which I'll talk about later. Now for probably the smoothest thing in the dev process is I decided to redesign Risi tweaks. During the development process of the original Risi tweaks, I wanted it to be modular so that I could modify the tweak tool if I ever wanted to add a second desktop option to risiOS or do something like a mobile version. And because of this, the original Risi tweaks did something where every page was a YAML file and the UI was literally structured using the file and directory names of the YAML files. And then each YAML file would contain all of the options within the page. The issue is, after I implemented this, I decided I wanted to add an extension manager to Risi tweaks. So then I kind of added the extension manager on top of it trying to generate pages from YAML, and it just created a mess of a code base. which wasn't helped when I decided to add our theme and risiScript integration to risiTweaks, which just created a huge giant mess of a code base, and I decided I wasn't going to do that again with the new version of risiTweaks. So I've decided to do a complete rewrite from scratch using LBRY, and this is definitely the smoothest part of the development process because editing decomp settings is not hard to do, and I didn't even have to design custom GDK widgets for this due to the excellent Adwaita action row widgets in LBRY. The only difficult part I had was implementing these amazing looking accent buttons for the accent color switcher, thanks to Jamie, who is a GNOME contributor, for helping me with this. I also didn't implement an extension tool anymore because the stock extension manager just works fine, it's not worth the duplicate of effort. And overall, it turned out to be, in my opinion, a much better designed alternative to GNOME Tweaks, with all the duplicate options in GNOME Control Center removed from the tweak tool, as well as options for our theme. It still is less functionally useful because risiScript has been removed and the extension part of risiTweaks have been removed too, but overall I think it turned out well. So because of how fast I reworked risiTweaks, I was feeling pretty confident. I had about a month left in the dev cycle, and I decided to rewrite the welcome screen. I thought it would be pretty easy because it's really just a bunch of buttons and links and everything. However, the issue is I removed risiScript and I didn't want to remove the quick setup feature. So I redesigned it to make the quick setup feature always show first on your first boot. And since I no longer depended on risiScript, I had to re-implement the entire terminal and everything from scratch and all the prompts that let you pick things like your browser and drivers and everything. While this sounds cool, and it did end up turning out well, this was not something I could do in just 1 month of development, because it had to generate an entire bash script from your options and widgets. I had to add error handling and make sure it was stable and reliable. And all of this was stuff risiScript did before, and I had to implement that in the risiWelcome on its own with a new UI. This ended up causing risiOS 38 to be delayed because I had a lot of quality control issues involving risiWelcome where things just didn't work. And I didn't end up finishing that redesign until around a month after Fedora 38 came out, and then I spent the rest of the 2 or 3 weeks I delayed it just battling random bugs within the OS. I probably should have just shipped the original risiWelcome, but it did have that dated GTK3 design, and risiScript was removed, so I still would have had to re-implement something like risiScript, and it just would have came out being worse than the original version of risiWelcome. And risiWelcome's kind of the main reason to install risiOS, so kind of not something I wanted to do. Overall, the dev cycle was definitely my worst one between the first version of 36 and the 37 dev cycle. 38 was by far the worst. I delayed so long that there was a Debian release in between Fedora 38 and risiOS 38, and finding a new Debian release is like finding a unicorn. At least I beat LBRY to the 38 release. That said, I hope you enjoyed the story of the dev process, and I hope to make a return to YouTube this summer. That said, thanks to my patrons. I lost a bunch of them because I haven't been uploading, but thanks to Sam Covett for still being a $10 a month supporter. I'll see you in the next one.